Welcome everybody to this episode of Unscripted, and it's my great pleasure that we've got Warren Hogan with us, a renowned economist. He has his own business called Q Economics. He's worked with Judo Bank, ANZ, Treasury. He's actually a professor. So this is a man that we want to listen to, and he's not shy of having an unbridled conversation. So Warren Hogan, welcome. And above that, give us a bit more on you.
Well, thanks for having me. It's good to be on the show and an opportunity to have a longer conversation about what's going on. My background is pretty standard market economist for the first 20 years of my career, where I was a bond strategist in the dealing room and traveled the world selling Australia to investors, and got to the top of that as chief economist of ANZ, and now run my own business, EQ Economics, for the last 10 years. Spent some time at Treasury and in academia, but for the last 5 years been focused on my main client, which is Judo Bank, which is a fantastic new player in the Australian banking scene. And I'm essentially an independent economist. So, with 30 years experience, focused on the data, focused on what matters for business, investors. I'm here to say it as I see it, give it my best shot. And, I've worked very hard to be independent, and there's a lot of bias in economic analysis, political bias, financial bias, and it's pretty hard to stand up to that because people have a crack. But that's what I'm trying to do, and hopefully add some value to our community and my customers.
Well, I mean, it's hot to trot. Everybody's talking about what's happening with the war at the moment. But if we just rewind the tape a little bit, Warren, what was it like before the war? How were we tracking?
Yeah, this is really important, and it's one of my key messages right now, that we should not forget what was going on in this economy on the 28th of February before the Israelis dropped that bomb on the Ayatollah and started all of this, because we learnt over the course of the last summer that essentially both the RBA and the government's economic strategies was not working. That is, we had seen this sort of reasonably modest pickup in consumer spending and business activity in the back half of 2025, and that straight away saw inflation pick up, confirming that the RBA's what they used to call a narrow path strategy, or this strategy of not raising rates as much as they would have in the past, or other central banks were back in 2024, 23, 24, didn't get the job done on inflation. Now, sure, it kept the economy going and kept unemployment low, but their primary task is to control inflation. And with that big pickup in inflation through the second half of 25, right up until February, leaves us very vulnerable to this shock that's coming out of the Middle East, which is at the moment primarily an energy shock with the disruption of oil supply. So we had an economy that essentially was overheating. We had a central bank that was going about things not right. They weren't getting the job done. We're entering our 6th year of above target inflation. And of course, we've got a government that just doesn't seem to have much respect for economic reality. They're out there spending money, pretty much willy-nilly. It's sad to say. I don't want to over-egg it, but it's just every 6 months we get a new set of numbers that tell us that the spending's bigger and bigger and our tax burden's bigger and bigger. We have seen a structural shift up in the size of government, or the presence of government in our economy, and particularly the last 3 years, which I think is dangerous to our economic performance and our social stability. So we were not well positioned, and of course this shock could not have come at a worse time, because it's going to reveal those problems. We had a domestic inflation driven by too much demand, too much government spending, and a recovery in private sector spending, which is going to interact with a supply shock-driven increase in energy prices. And of course, what economists want to see, or what they worry about, is not so much the fact that petrol prices go up, because even as we're seeing now, they're coming down again, but it's whether that increase in petrol prices flows through quickly to other prices in the economy. That's the stuff that remains. That's the inflation. And of course, I'm very worried that we will see that. We're getting lots of evidence of that, people talking about that, businesses talking about that, construction costs, transport costs. So yeah, we were not in a good space. And of course, politically, there's going to be all these motivations to say, oh, well, it's the war and this, to cover up for failures of the past. But as a nation, we have got to be honest with ourselves about what was not going right or what was going wrong, because we'll keep making mistakes. And of course, we have built one of the best economies the world's ever seen in the last 40 years. It started with Hawke and Keating, high-performing, flexible economy. We stood shock after shock from the world economy. But we're sort of giving that back, in my view, with this big increase in government spending, government presence, government regulation. And of course, the analogy I use is, we built the equivalent of Oscar Piastri's Formula One car as an economy, but we're sort of starting to stick Holden and Ford parts on it. And something's going to go wrong. And, no one wants to see Oscar in the wall at the end of the straight. But anyway, that's a scary analogy, but you know what I'm trying to get at.
Hey, so Warren, and following on with what Joe's been saying, is that, when we're in that, I hate using the term pre-war for some reason. It makes me feel really bad. In this pre-Middle East issue, so before that all started, were we as a country in a reasonable space, knowing possibly it wasn't brilliant economically, but was it in a reasonable space and now things have changed? Or was it, what's your view of back then, before?
Yeah, look, I'm not sure it was. I mean, look, there's lots of great stuff, and we should always, be appreciative and grateful of what we've built in the last 30 years, and the quality of the food and the consistency of the supply, and just what a high standard of living we created in Australia. But my job as an economist is to sort of highlight when you start to do things that jeopardize that, because in terms of the big economy, bad decisions don't show up as bad outcomes potentially for years, and we are starting to make some of them. So, the one for me is just the standard of living. So we've seen with this persistent inflation that wages have not been able to keep up with. For the average Australian or the broad sort of mass of Australians, most of them have got a lower real wage or real income or standard of living, what they can buy, than they had 4 years ago. And, that has been going on for 4 years. We haven't seen anything like that since probably World War II. That's a step back for that amount of time. And, you look at we've got all these social issues, which I'm not even going to touch on. But politically, the thing that I think's really changed since the re-emergence of this inflation, since it was confirmed that we didn't get on top of it, that the RBA didn't get rid of it, was the rise of One Nation. And in that election in May last year, they got like 4% of the vote. And then essentially the inflation started rising about that time. It got down to about 3, just under, and then it's been going up, and it's around 3.5 now. But that sort of pivot from inflation coming down gradually, but now going up again, it scarily coincides with the rise of the One Nation primary vote in polls. They overtook the Greens at around that 10-12% primary vote around October. And then the big moment was around Australia Day this year, when they overtook the Liberal Party. And of course, people were speculating about the polls, but we got confirmation that this is real in the South Australian election. So look, maybe I'm overstating it, but that One Nation getting 20-25% of the primary vote, given all we know about One Nation in the last 30 years and what we know about what we are as a nation, as a country, is for me pretty much the modern Australian equivalent of people carrying pitchforks in the street. So I think there's a lot of really great things, and we've still got a wonderful natural resource base. We've still got a great legal system. We've still got great people, pragmatic and smart and principled people. But things are starting to break down, and it's not about social division or that. That's an issue, whatever, but we're breaking down our economy, and that's what matters.
Do you think the extraordinarily low interest rate environment we had for a very long period of time, I guess in an interest rate environment, do you think that added to the problem?
Look, in as much as it's caused a sort of a radical shift in rates, it may have, but not really. I mean, look, interest rates have probably been lower than they should have been for much of probably 10 years now. I mean, before the pandemic, we were sort of sucked into lower rates by what was going on globally because we are so engaged with the world economy and have a floating exchange rate. If Europe and US rates are at zero, we can't hold rates at 5% because our currency will go through the roof and wreck our exports. So, look, I'm not sure that it's the main thing. I think what it is, we heard this sort of big social attitudinal shift with the pandemic. We've sort of as a community lost any, this idea that there's some sacrifice in the short term for the long term. This idea that, you can't upset people, that, everyone takes offense. There's something that's fundamental to the Australian character of the last 200 years that's changing. And I think that's, an economic story as well as a social story, because what we've seen is our tax burden go up. Australians are happy to pay taxes. The first lot of taxes you pay are to cover the things you need: roads, hospitals, education. And then Australians are willing to pay some more tax to look after the less fortunate. But there's a point where your tax burden gets to where it's just sort of, it's inconsistent with where we've been in the past. And it takes a lot of persuading, I think, for people to, okay, well, if you're going to tax me more, what is it being spent on? And because these things are almost impossible to measure and they're slow moving, you don't really find out it's a problem until it's a problem. And I think that's part of the issue. People getting taxed, the cost of living. So the squeeze on people's living standards that happened in 2023 with the big increase in inflation, the big increase in interest rates, and of course, the one thing that people don't talk enough about is the bracket creep, the fact that our real tax burden has gone up because we've been going up tax brackets. That was the biggest decline in household sector real income for the whole household sector in Australia that we've seen in the last 60 years. And it was bigger than what happened in the financial crisis of the early 90s, the recession we had to have, where we saw unemployment double from 5.5% to 11%. So we had a bigger hit to our living standards than when 5% of the workforce lost their job. Now, some people will say that was sort of how we paid for the adjustment, that everyone copped it rather than the 5% who lost their jobs. And there's all these sort of stories that one of the problems with economics is that people just sort of make it up. And there's been a lot of making it up lately. The problem is that we're going backwards. And what worries me is that, putting aside these social developments and political developments, I'm worried that something's going to break in the economy before long.
So with all that in the background, what's the impact of the war?
Look, at the moment, the initial hit is clearly the big response has been around people's sort of sentiment, confidence, fears. We're picking that up in all of the surveys out there of business and consumer confidence, sentiment, what have you, and major shifts. So consumer confidence measured by the Melbourne Institute, Westpac Melbourne Institute survey, which is the monthly one that's been going on for 40 odd years, is right back to where it was 3 years ago, when we had that massive squeeze on household incomes. And consumer confidence was recovering in the last 12, 18 months, but it never even got back to neutral, never even got back to 100, or it might have got there for a month or two at the end of last year. So we've sort of had this recovery in consumer confidence in 2025 and consumer spending, and then that's just gone all the way back. Now, the data we've got so far on spending is that consumer spending hasn't stopped. So at the moment, it's a case of people are worried, but they're not stopping spending. And of course, the employment numbers were good in March. So it's the worry that's out there, and that worry is yet to translate, as far as we can tell, into actual spending decisions or putting off. Businesses, we're not sure. There's obviously businesses that are massively impacted by the increased cost of fuel, diesel, worries about access. But it doesn't seem like the NAB survey, which is a really good survey of businesses, the confidence collapsed, but the conditions, what's actually happening, didn't. It actually only fell a tiny bit. It's still net positive. So so far it's a worry. And this is why the main issue in terms of what's happening in the Middle East is the duration. The longer it lasts, the more chance it is of having a significant negative economic impact. The US government, Trump said initially it was a 4 to 6 weeks. He extended that by 2 to 3. That takes us through till the end of April. I think if it feels a bit like a stalemate. I mean, if this drags into May and June, it gets more of a risk, because the main concern for our economy is inflation is here. It's an inflationary shock because of the price of energy, and that affects everything. But what we're really looking out for is, does it actually cause consumers and businesses to stop spending, stop investing? And so far, we're not seeing any evidence of that, but that's what we're looking for.
Yeah, like we talk about the impact of what's in the Middle East. We talk about the fuel, but there's also the fertilizer side of aspects and the production of grains and how that flows into our everyday groceries. Yep, you're saying people are still spending even though those things are going up. I know price seems to have leveled. The price of fuel seems to have leveled back a little bit, but is there still a flow-on effect yet to be felt from our farmers and fertilizers?
Yeah, and the retail petrol price is not necessarily reflective of, say, a wholesale diesel, which is what businesses will need. That's still elevated. And even if even if the US and Iran come to terms and the straits are open, or the Strait of Hormuz is open, there's been damage to production. This is going to take months to flow through, and energy prices aren't going back to where they were, so there is this shift up. The fertilizer is another interesting example. We're totally dependent on it. So farmers are right now making decisions. For example, wheat farmers about, do we put in a winter crop? They're having to pay more for the diesel to run the machines to put the crop in. Then they're going to be obviously waiting as that comes through till about October, November, and they're going to be unsure. At the moment, they're getting fertilizer. It's expensive. Is there going to be problems getting access later? What's the yield going to be like? I heard a saying from a Gold Coast property developer about 18 months ago that said, I'll make more money sitting on the beach this year. And that was a comment on the economics of property development, probably not just in the Gold Coast. But if a farmer's going to make more money sitting on the porch, it's actually an economy that's not working. If people who are important parts of our economy decide they're better off doing nothing, we've got a problem. We've never seen that in the last 30 years, but it seems to be something that's coming up more often. So we've got a very challenging period the next 3 months. I think by mid-June, we're going to have a very much clearer picture, and let's all hope the hostilities are over and supply chains are normalising, but our economy is going to take a hit.
So, Warren, you've talked about lots of fascinating things today, but the theme that I'm picking up is we're almost going through a bit of an identity crisis as well. The Aussie battler, who we are. I mean, most people these days have given away thoughts of ever owning a home. We're going to have some tough decisions to make. I know particularly brokers, carry a lot when they support their clients. A lot of Australian consumers will be very concerned around what's going to happen. What do they need to do with their finances? Will they be able to afford their borrowing and their lending? What's going to happen with interest rates, serviceability, all of these things? There's so many questions. But in terms of really having that sort of hail Jesus moment that, hey, we've got to make some difficult decisions, what do you think that's going to look like in the next couple of months?
Well, look, the budget's the most important thing, and what the government's response is to this. So far, they've been somewhat disciplined. It's, the cuts to the excise and some offering of loan support to affected businesses. It's $1 billion here, $1 billion there. That's pretty much peanuts in the scheme of things. Let's see what they do. The reality is that we have an economy that's overheating. We can only grow the economy so fast, and that's about 2%. And as soon as the economy is growing faster than 2%, or demand in the economy is growing faster than 2%, we can't make any more widgets, so the price of widgets goes up, it turns into inflation. And that's essentially the rationing mechanism that a market is, and happens throughout the economy constantly. Government spending at around 3%. And so if we've got a consumer that wants to spend at 2%, and is about half or a bit more than the economy, but we've got a government that's spending at 3%, well, we're locked into above potential or above capacity growth, which is just going to keep creating inflation and putting upward pressure on rates. And then if businesses are out there spending, which they want to because of technology and the need to refit themselves for a different future with AI and various things, If this thing, in a way, if we don't have a recession because of what's happening in the Middle East, and we sort of keep powering through this, and if the government throws any stimulus at the economy, we're going to end up creating an inflation problem that, although the magnitudes are different to the late 80s, the Reserve Bank might just have to keep raising rates till the economy sort of cracks, which is what happened in 89. Now, we're not going anywhere near a 17.5%.
Hope not.
No, but that might be a 6%. So that's the bad scenario, and that's probably a mid-27, and that's actually what I call a boom bust. That is, we don't go into recession now, but the economy gets through it and there's lots of money and inflation picks up and then the rates go up and next year there's a crash sort of thing. I doubt we're going to have a sort of a major sort of reassessment without some sort of a crisis. So there's the other route is a political crisis. So, the next federal election's obviously a couple of years away, but, if One Nation keeps going like it is, I think the Liberal Party, the National Liberal Coalition, has probably got about 6 months. That if they can't get back on top of One Nation in the polls by the end of this year, then they're at risk of losing funding and actual talent to One Nation ahead of the next election. And then if we're staring down the barrel of an election that's going to be fought between sort of some morphed modern version of One Nation versus the ALP, that's I don't even know what that looks like, but it's a very different world to what we've been seeing for 50 years. And then, of course, the next issue is whether the Greens start getting more than 10, 12% support, and that just shows that we're moving out away from the centre, and I just see that as being something that, well, we haven't seen it, so it's not sure. And that'll probably end up in an economic crisis too. So what's the good news around this? The good news is, and what's caught economists by surprise since the pandemic, it's been happening around the world. Japan was first, but this massive demographic shift that is the baby boomers retiring means that we've gone from an economy that had excess labour where we couldn't find enough jobs for people. Unemployment was a problem for the last 40 years. We now have the opposite problem. We have a shortage of labour. We've got 330,000 job vacancies, all industries with the exception of finance and insurance. And what that means is people are going to have jobs. And that's why unemployment's not going up. And that's why the RBA sort of this idea that they're trying to sort of keep unemployment low and go easy on inflation was misguided, because unemployment was always going to be low because of this demographic shift. And they should have jumped on the inflation. And that's the big mistake we've made from their point of view. But the good news is people will have jobs. And if they lose their job, there'll be other jobs. Now, we've got to be prepared as a nation that with AI coming, that 25% of jobs will probably go in the next decade, and another 25% will be fundamentally changed. Now, for young ones, that's fine. They'll be totally at ease with that. That'll happen naturally. But there's a cohort of Australians who are sitting right now in jobs, and probably many of them with mortgages, who are going to be confronted with needing to basically go from working in an office to working in a childcare centre or join the military or be a police officer, because there's heaps of jobs. But Australians are bad at changing jobs, and the government's whole ethos is about actually locking the labour market down, not making it more flexible. That roundtable that the Treasurer had last year should have been all about helping people change jobs, making it less emotionally and financially stressful to change jobs. But from your broker community cohort's point of view, I don't think credit risk is the problem, because there are jobs there to be had. And what we saw in the late 80s, and I was only a kid, was that Australians would eat rice before they defaulted on their mortgage. And they paid 17.5% for about a year. And the default rates were, up, but we got through it. Now, I just think there's the risks in the economy are different to what we've known, and it's not around defaulting on a mortgage necessarily. House prices could easily go down 20%. But people who are going to suffer from that are probably people who are super leveraged and not owner-occupiers but investors. That could be a bit of an issue. So look, we just don't understand the risk, and one of the issues in this country in the last 5 years, which all nations have faced in one shape or form, is that the economy's changed, and until our leadership and our sort of economists in RBA and government understand what it means, they're probably going to be making the wrong policy moves. So yeah, it's a hideously complex world that this conflict in the Middle East only magnifies that complexity.
I mean, it's it's almost a bit of a doom and gloom conversation. But
Yeah.
look, is there any brightness at the end of this? What's the economic forecast looking like? Are we at risk of falling into that really horrible R word, which we talk about recession, which means we have that F word that follows on, which means we're far away from where we want to be? What's that look like? Hopefully there's some positivity comes out the back of this.
Yeah, well, look, this technology that's coming through is one of the most important general purpose technologies that's ever been around in terms of the sheer power of computing and, of course, the application with that of AI. I can envisage a world where we see an increase in the living standards and just the human condition within a generation like we've never seen before. And history shows that when we have these, what I call sort of major regime shifts in society, and that's what is on the cards here. This is not just, the invention of the mobile phone. It's probably even bigger than the internet in many ways because of how quickly it's going to run through. But it actually brings together everything around this information revolution that's been going for 70 years. But the offer of such a much better future where the access to information, the inability to be manipulated, propaganda is really incredible and something we should all be very hopeful of. The problem is when you go through such a big change, there's a lot of vested interests that want to resist that change. And that goes from everything from economic policy to social policy to everything. And of course, when you start swimming against the tide, because we're not putting the technology back in the box, the demographics ain't going to change. And unless you swim with it and try and accept these realities and go with it as a leader, as a policymaker, if you try and resist it, history shows what ends up happening is you do have an economic crisis, because if you don't allow resources in the economy, labor and capital, those in savings and people's jobs, to adjust, if you don't facilitate that, if you resist it, then eventually the economy breaks and then you see a rapid reallocation of those resources. You're not going to avoid it. And unfortunately, we sort of look like we're heading that way. But what does it mean? I don't know. But look, that's the way I think about it is we have an incredibly bright future ahead. But we've got to cross a pretty bumpy river, ocean to get there. And of course, this conflict in the Middle East is very scary for a whole range of reasons. But it also could be part of this process, because I also believe that we're not really going to be at ease on this planet until we're all on the same page. And at the moment, and for the last 15 years, or last 10 years anyway, we haven't been, because we've got actors like China and Russia and Iran that are running very much at odds with the existing world order of free trade and globalization. So maybe this is also just a transitory period and Trump's a catalyst for change. I don't know. But anyway, there's a lot to be worried about. But as the great investor, I think it was Warren Buffett, the great investor, said, it's always darkest before the dawn.
And that it is. And there are so many other things in a positive faction that are happening. Oh, yes, the US have gone back to the moon, and so has China. Things that are evolving in different areas as well. I kind of wonder if they're the part of the global good news stories, whilst we're dealing with that other dark side of the conversation with what's happening in the Middle East. So you're trying to get that balance of that yin-yang balance of good and bad, if you like.
Yeah, well, I suppose. I think, I obviously spend my time analysing not just what's going on and thinking about the future, but, obviously studying the past. So, I assume and know that generally people don't have that knowledge base. And the thing is, when things look concerning, people do get worried, and then it gets even harder to see the light or to be positive. And we are in one of those moments. And that's why these things feed on themselves. And it does unfortunately feel like we're in one of those periods where, we're heading for some sort of, well, as you alluded to, some sort of moment where we're going to realize whether it's the way we're running Australia or what's happening with technology or international geopolitical conflict, whatever it is, none of it is sustainable. change is coming, and this is something, even though humans in history have had decades, if not hundreds of years, where nothing much changes, we're not in that world for the last 100 years or so, if not a bit longer. We're in a world of rapid change because of technology, and there's just so many smart people on this planet with so much tools. But we've got to accept that. We can't stick our heads in the sand. And if you try and stick your head in the sand, you're going to get run over. So you got to try and not get caught up in the doom and gloom. But by the same token, you can't ignore it. So you got to try to see it analytically, in my view. I mean, then again, I don't think many people are sort of in my situation have all this time thinking about it.
Yeah, I was about to say too, Warren, the disinformation, the confusion. I mean, at the moment we're having fraud with AI, manipulation of documents, and it's hard to know what is really true. So for the average person listening to this podcast, aside from dialing in and listening to the amazing conversation with you, how are they actually going to find a barometer through this? Where do you turn for accurate information? I have friends who basically say their sport of today is to wake up and have a look at their phone and see what Trump did overnight because, it's any best guess as to which way we're heading. So, how does the average Australian redefine who we are, decide that we want to get up off the beach and actually get something done, in a way that, we can bring the country together? And how do we find that source of information moving forward?
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I'd suggest not doing that, just looking at your phone for what Trump did. And look, one thing I've noticed, I mean, I've got a 22-year-old and a 13-year-old daughters, and, even the difference between them, like the 13-year-old, she was navigating YouTube on an iPad before she could speak. I mean, their feelings about this digital world are going to be very different. Look, the general, what's happening is the internet and supercomputing is actually giving all of us more access to information, which means that we should have less dictatorship, less propaganda, less misinformation. Now, this phase, this first decade, 20 years has been sort of chaotic. And as much of that is that people like us who came from a world that existed before, we're confused, whereas kids growing into it are less confused by it. But the underlying process that's going on is that, we do need good governments and we do need good business leaders to show character and to make sure we're regulating and we're jumping on bad guys and all of this sort of stuff. But generally speaking, this is taking us into a better place where we should be able to actually identify bad guys and identify bad behaviours, and all within hopefully what is still a free and open society. So look, I know it sounds a little bit esoteric, I suppose. It seems hopeful, but one thing I think that's really important for us as a community, particularly in Australia, but across the world, is we need leaders. I think one of the biggest problems in this country with representative democracy is that we have now political professionals, people who are in it from day one. And of course, what is politics? Politics is about, there's two elements to it. One is getting elected and one is doing something that's good for the nation for the future. The balance is shifted towards getting re-elected in the last 20 years. And to the point now where, what's the priority of our leaders? Is it your party and your party's future, whether that's the next election or the next 10 years, or is it the nation's future? And of course, one thing with politicians is they're really good at talking themselves into things, making themselves believe it. But, we need people of character who are not willing to, who need to put the well-being of the whole community, even if there's some winners and losers within that, ahead of their own interests, be it their own personal interests or the interests of their particular organisation. And I'd say, the last great leader we had in that respect, and John Howard was a fantastic Prime Minister, but demonstrably was Bob Hawke. And he was a great statesman, a visionary, a great influencer, and he took the people of this country. Admittedly, had some great cabinet ministers, and he had Keating out there. teaching us all about the economy as it was being taught by Treasury officials. But we need that back. But now what we're getting is, leadership, which is, what's it leading to? Big government and division. And I just don't think, and look, I don't think we're going to have representative democracy in 30 years, 40 years' time. I think we're going to have direct democracy. I think that's part of this digital revolution. But yes, there's a long way to go between now and then, and that's well into the future.
Pete, I don't know about you, but I think this is a Friday night dinner party conversation. I had no idea this podcast was going to go in this direction, but I'm fascinated with what you've got to share, Warren.
Look, Warren, a fantastic conversation it is, and I think a conversation that will continue on in different frames for quite some time with different people, and whether it be around what's happening with our economy, what's going to happen in the political environment. I think the political environment of the future is quite fascinating to hypothesise and see what might or might not be as we go forward, regardless of what pollings are showing today. But I think that's an interesting landscape in the future. But of course, we've got to sort this Middle East thing out sooner than later. It's in other people's hands. So everything crossed, that's what happens, and gets everything stabilised again as soon as possible. But I guess there's always a something, isn't there, Warren? I mean, we've been through lots over the years. We've been through GFCs, pandemics, and many other things. And
the Aussie battler.
Yeah, that's just probably why. Always in there batting. But mate, Warren, thank you so much. Q Economics, legendary economist extraordinaire. Mate, thanks so much for the conversation, and we must do this again sometime soon.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for having me on the show, and let's all hope for the best.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Warren.